After that kind of introduction, we have to be really good.
Wow, yeah, big pressure.
Okay. But we are good, so that's fine. Yeah.
I'll rely on you, Susi.
It'll be fine. We'll do great. We've done great things before. We'll continue. We are going to talk about money. And it's always interesting to talk about money because culturally, people react to conversations about money in a lot of different ways. And so some people get really uncomfortable. And some people think, ooh, they get really crafty. And the nuclear industry thinks, how do we make more? And so we're going to talk about that. I'm going to get started, and then I'll hand it over to Kjølv. And then we're going to try to open it up to questions. So, think about what you might want to ask. Think about the burning thing. What do you want to know about money and nuclear weapons? And while we may cover it already, we may not. So keep tuned. Stay tuned, as they say. So first, let's remember, when we talk about nuclear weapons, who has what, right? This is very important to keep our mind on. Every time we talk about these issues, we have to keep our mind, who has nuclear weapons? It's 9 countries. That is not a lot. There's 5 more that have weapons on their territory. That is not a lot. And that gives us hope. It gives us power. It gives us the opportunity to change. There are about 13,000 of them in the world, and there's a lot of money that does go into building these weapons. How much money? Well, we'll get into that. But there's a whole industry. Let's see. Yeah, there's a whole industry behind this, behind nuclear weapons. And that's something that people don't often think about. They think, oh, nuclear weapons, they're made by governments alone. But it's not true. There's a huge industry behind it, and it's not just your standard defense sector. There are others involved in heavy industry, others involved in logistics, supply chain management. The nuclear industry is a little bit bigger than we sometimes think about. But the industry behind nuclear weapons, beyond that make the missiles, that make the components, who try to profit from the companies that build these parts. All of this comprise the nuclear industry in one way or another. And there are banks and financial institutions that lend certain companies money. I'll touch on that in a minute. But first, let me talk about the spending that happens in each country. It is enormous. And the last research that we published is $82.4 billion spent on nuclear weapons. And that was in 2021, $82.4 billion. It was $6.5 billion higher than the year before. Let me break it down for you, because it's different in different countries. The US spends the most. The US spends $44 billion in 1 year on nuclear weapons. China comes up at $11 billion. Russia, $8.5. The UK, 6.8. France is less than 6. India is about 2.5. Israel's about 1 billion. Pakistan's about 1 billion. And North Korea, which is often painted as one of the gravest nuclear threats on the planet, spends less than $1 billion a year on nuclear weapons. They spend $642 million. Numbers can get confusing, and I know that, and I'm going to toss a lot of numbers at you, but that's why I made some slides. So here's what they look like. This is what the spending was on nuclear weapons in 2021. Altogether, that is $157,000 a minute. $157,000. Now, I don't know about you and what kind of work you do, but more money spent on nuclear weapons a minute than I take home in more than a year. And it's difficult to imagine these numbers. And I want to kind of put it in some perspective. So what does 1 minute of nuclear weapons spending look like? It looks like a year of full and comprehensive health care for 50,000 children. 1 minute of nuclear weapons spending, 1 minute, is 1 year of salary for 2 elementary school teachers. I might be going through a theme here. 1 minute of spending could also provide 18 public housing units for a year. 1 minute of nuclear weapons spending could help 18 families have secure housing. Could get 18 people living rough into a home. 1 minute of spending. So when we talk about nuclear weapons, we talk about the risks that they pose to our health. We talk about the risks that they pose to the environment. What we sometimes forget is to talk about the risks that they pose to our society, the opportunity costs that are lost on nuclear weapons spending. You can probably tell by my accent, I am from the US originally, and my tax dollars get broken down like this. I paid in US taxes $67 for nuclear weapons in 2021 as an individual. So did the 350 million others. $67 per taxpayer just on nuclear weapons. Do you know how much an individual taxpayer in the US spent on combating climate change? $5. Think about what we could do when we go after the money. But, it's like I said, it's companies that build nuclear weapons. And they do this, and they do this also with the support of those who want to make a profit, right? Because they don't go after and take these contracts to build nuclear weapons for the greater good. They do it to make some money. Tax money goes into these private companies. And what we showed is about 35% of the money spent on nuclear weapons goes to contractors. It's a lot. It's a lot. And I heard somebody earlier describe it as the global weapons cartel. And I like that, so I'm going to start using it. But who are the companies? Well, yeah. These are the companies. These are a lot of the companies that are involved in nuclear weapons production. Some of them are very familiar. People know Lockheed Martin makes weapons. People know Raytheon makes weapons. We know General Dynamics, they make weapons. But Boeing and Airbus also make nuclear weapons. Boeing makes parts for intercontinental ballistic missiles, and Airbus builds components for the French nuclear arsenal. So let's look a little bit at what some of them do. Most of the companies involved in the production of nuclear weapons do so for more than one government. And that's something we don't think about. We think, oh yes, one government, one company, or one group of companies. No, it's twisted. And it's kind of fun to pick apart, because all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute. The UK does not have an independent nuclear deterrent. The UK leases its nuclear weapons system from the US. The UK, as a matter of fact, pays the United States government to contract companies like BAE Systems, Boeing, to make Trident nuclear missiles. Not very independent. I don't know, but maybe it's the British way? I don't know. Somebody's going to have to catch me on that later. Northrop Grumman is one of the bigger companies, and they're involved in the production of nuclear weapons, and they're designing a new generation of nuclear weapons. And this is something I'm personally quite worried about, because we have these intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? These missiles that are designed to be launched from one continent and in 35 minutes go across the world and attack a target and kill 100 million people in a flash. That's what they're designed to do. Northrop Grumman is building a new generation of these weapons for the US. And they call them the ground-based strategic deterrent, but that is a mouthful. So now they're called Sentinel. And I would really like to know who gets the job to name these weapons, because that could be a fun job. Trident, Sentinel, Vanguard, Victory, La Triomphante, right? Could be fun. Or maybe just Death Machine, I don't know. But what's weird is that Northrop Grumman is building these brand new systems, but BAE Systems just got a contract to extend the current system for another 10 years. Seems like somebody's double dipping. And it's almost like the weapons themselves don't actually matter, just making profits. And those profits go to investors. So let's talk about the investors. Last year, investors made $746 billion available to the nuclear weapons industry. That means banks, pension funds, asset managers, and so on, they lent money or they held shares, owned stocks, bought bonds to make this money available, to give this capital to the industry. And they do that to make money back. Nobody gives somebody else money for nothing. Or, maybe they do, but I don't see it. I'm American, right? I don't see it that much, right? They do it to make money. And they do it because these weapons producers are saying they'll generate positive returns. They will keep getting these contracts. There's nothing that's going to stop the production of nuclear weapons. The biggest investors are in the US, with Vanguard and State Street topping the pack. Vanguard and State Street, they hold funds. That's why they're the biggest. So it's not them as individuals just saying, ooh, let's go and invest in the industry. They hold mutual funds, they hold electronic traded funds for big investors. If you have a big connected to a big pension fund, there's a very good chance that you are connected to Vanguard or to State Street. And the reason that all of the top investors are in the US is because most of the companies are US-based. But when we bring it back to Europe, we find that BNP Paribas, a French bank, that has a huge public relations commitment to sustainable development, to achieving a carbon-neutral future. BNP Paribas is the biggest investor in Europe, and they invest at least $12 billion in companies to build nuclear weapons. They're complicit in the nuclear weapons cycle, because if they didn't lend money to the bomb builders, those builders wouldn't have the capital to keep going after the contracts. They wouldn't be able to bid on new contracts, and they wouldn't be able to have the cash flow to deal with the labor problems that they're facing, the supply chain shortages, to remind people, oh, no, we're still good guys, we're still good guys. Yeah, we're delayed. We'll send some lobbyists in. Because they hire lobbyists that argue that nuclear weapons are necessary and that these contractors should build them. And they also fund think tanks to help keep the narrative away from nuclear abolition. So I personally believe the nuclear industry is a nefarious one. They have labor problems, they have cash flow issues, and they make the worst weapons ever designed. And they use their cash, the cash that comes from my bank account, that comes from my pension plan. They use their cash to buy power and influence to keep this going. And now it's Kjølv's turn to tell you how that happens.
Thank you, Susi. Thanks very much. That was an excellent overview, I thought. I'm going to be speaking about a sort of much narrower slice of this whole topic of the role of money in nuclear weapons politics. I'm going to talk about the role of money in nuclear weapons policy expertise. Essentially, the question I'm asking is, who pays the experts? Who pays the policy experts? And how is the debate formed? So it's a slightly different angle into this question, but Susi touched on it briefly. So in recent years, a lot of scholars of international relations and contemporary history, people like me, have written in books and articles and concluded that the nuclear weapons policy discourse, sort of the big debate that we have between different experts and policymakers, is extremely narrow and conservative. Generally, the debate takes place within quite narrow confines, and to exaggerate a bit, often the discussion is whether the missiles should be blue or red, or that kind of thing. And so my question that I wanted to analyze was why is that? And of course, other people have also tried to answer this question, and one hypothesis has been that maybe it has to do with how the policy expertise is funded, how the people who work at different think tanks raise funds for their institutions. So this hypothesis has been investigated a little bit, but not very much. And we wanted to do that. So my co-author and I, Benoit Pelopidas. So what we did was we collated a list of all the top-ranked think tanks in the world. Now, what is a think tank? Perhaps we should talk about that first. A think tank is an institution, usually a non-profit, that exists to inform the public and policymakers about complicated policy issues, maybe do some research, and perhaps in an ideal world, they would help solve intractable, difficult problems, be really innovative, come up with good ideas for how to improve the world. But as we just concluded earlier, the state of affairs appears to be that this nuclear weapons policy discourse is really narrow, and there aren't really any new solutions being offered. It's a very small c conservative debate. As you all know, the nuclear weapons ban treaty, the TPNW, often gets short shrift in these expert debates and in the mainstream media. So what we did was we made this list of the top-ranked think tanks in the world. We relied on an existing index made by the University of Pennsylvania, and we looked at the funding sources of the top 45 ranked think tanks in the world. So these are think tanks in the United States, in France, in the UK, but also in other parts of the world, like in Russia and China and Korea and Japan and all over the place, really. And so we wanted to check the lists of donors to these institutions, these think tanks, and look for funding by nuclear vested interests. And we operationalized that as companies that produce nuclear weapons, on the assumption that these companies are probably quite happy to continue to make nuclear weapons, and so have an interest in maintaining the status quo of continuous modernization. And we also looked for funding from governments that rely on or espouse nuclear deterrence theories. And what we found is, you can see some of it there is kind of what we expected, really, but we're fairly cynical people, that virtually all of these think tanks accept quite significant donations from either governments that espouse nuclear deterrence theories, strategies, or companies that produce nuclear weapons, or in most cases, both. And in most cases, several companies and several governments. The actual weight or relative importance of funding from these kinds of actors relative to others is difficult to determine because most think tanks are not quite transparent about the size of the various donations they receive. A lot of the time they just disclose the identity of a funder and not the size of the donation. But we think that in many cases these donations are really significant and an important part of these think tanks' budgets. The next thing that we did was then to do some interviews with people who work for these kinds of think tanks and also people who work for the institutions that provide them with funding, to ask them about their experiences. And this was the really interesting part of it for me. And I think through the interviews we were able to identify 3 negative effects that this kind of stakeholder funding or funded from vested interest has on the nuclear weapons policy debate, on essentially academic or intellectual freedom. And the first one is censorship. That every now and then one of these funders, let's say a large corporation or a state, will tell one of the think tanks they fund that they should stop writing what they write or saying what they say. This is, however, not very common. It happens every now and then, and some of the people we interviewed had experienced their research programs being cancelled, for example, or people being disinvited from events. But generally, this is not a huge phenomenon of censorship, at least in the Western think tanks. In Russia and China, for example, the story is obviously different because the think tanks there are generally very close to the government. So there is potentially even less intellectual freedom there. But then the next of these three mechanisms or effects that this kind of funding has on intellectual freedom is self-censorship. And we think this is a bigger problem than censorship. Because what this kind of funding does is it encourages the recipients of funding or prospective recipients of funding to tailor what they say to the interests of potential or existing donors. So many of the people we talk to who work for these think tanks, some of the most prestigious think tanks in the world, said openly that they engage in self-censorship all the time, that they refrain from making controversial arguments or even commenting on or doing research on controversial topics because it will be too difficult for their existing or potential funders. So that's probably an even bigger problem than censorship, outright censorship. But we think the really big problem, the main negative effect, is what we call platforming, which is the fact that the whole ecosystem of think tanks is rigged by these funding streams. That, of course, the think tanks that already and analysts that already agree with the viewpoints of the most wealthy funders, of course, are more likely to thrive, continue to exist, expand, become prestigious institutions because they're able to attract more funding. So I think this creates what we call a filtering effect. The problem isn't necessarily that think tanks are being told by funders what to think or how to change what they're saying, but it's more that those think tanks and analysts that already agree with the funders are more likely to continue to exist, to be elevated in the discourse. So what we have is not a free marketplace of ideas where the best and most innovative ideas win out, but rather a system where vested interests artificially keep some analysts and some think tanks artificially afloat for their own political interests. Then I'll just go on to say something about how this looks from the perspective of the donors or the institutions that provide the funding, because we talk to these people as well. And of course, one motivation for providing this kind of funding is to create knowledge, to sponsor expertise. But we found out pretty early on in the interviews that there are several other motivations as well. As Susi talked about, many of, especially these companies, are corporate actors that exist to make money. That is the reason why they exist. And so the funding to think tanks is a part of their strategy for increasing their profits and future-proofing their activities. They do not want a future where their activities are banned. So some of these other motivations include branding. It can be very attractive for these companies and governments to be associated with prestigious think tanks and research institutions. They look serious. We talk to, for example, someone who provides funding from a nuclear weapons contractor, a company that produces nuclear weapon systems. They said that they were not at all interested in the research that was being produced, beyond hoping that it would promote this self-censorship that I talked about, that they wouldn't say anything negative about the company. But the main thing they were after was branding, in their own words. The second one is networking, that these think tanks are often, they often act as hubs and arenas for networking. They're a meeting place for policymakers and corporate actors to talk about the future. A third one is that this funding is provided to support a certain narrative. This is perhaps obvious, that funding can be provided to promote certain ways of thinking, of viewing the world, perhaps supporting nuclear deterrence, for example. And then the final one of these motivations can also be to co-opt potential critics, is something we found from the interviews. That some of these funders, they see, there's a community, there's a research community or a policy analysis community there that maybe could be a problem for us. And then giving them money is a very good way of making them shut up. I think the broad implication of this research is to show that the global nuclear order, the state of affairs that we have now of continuous modernization of these existing nuclear arsenals is not immutable or unchangeable. It is continuously constructed and held in place. At least that's what these companies think. I just provided a little list of the most active of the corporate donors to think tanks. They are actively engaged in trying to hold this order in place. And what that tells me is that it can be changed. So while this is a very sad message in a way, that all of this stuff is going on, some people would find it sad at least, I think the overall takeaway is that this suggests that the whole thing is changeable. It can be changed for the better. So I think I'll turn it over to you there, Susi.
Great. Thank you very much. I think this type of research is so necessary, and if you haven't read Kjølv's piece, I highly encourage you to do so, because you just look, and it's the kind of thing where you have this gut feeling. Maybe this is what's happening. Maybe we're up against more than what meets the eye. Maybe there is something behind this narrative that we see constantly that gets the media attention. Who sits in front of the press as an expert commentator? Why is it so difficult for us, who are experts in this issue, to break through into that? It's this validation that's provided by the industry for a select few and their interests. I mean, this just validates that gut feeling. Maybe there's a reason that they're there. One thing we haven't talked about that I think is quite another interesting piece about this is who does get the space in media, who does get the voice in shaping public opinion that way. And it's another piece of research I think would be fascinating to do. Researcher, just suggesting. But I wanted to, before I open up to questions, I wanted to make one little comment about how there might be an opportunity and maybe a setback both when it comes to this work in the last year. First, I talked to a lot of banks. I talked to banks about their investment policies. I talked to banks about who they're financing. And in the last year, they're like, ooh, the arms industry, they're making some big money right now. They see Germany decide to increase its defense spending by ginormous amounts. They see this rush to weaponize. They see weapons being used, and every time a weapon is used, somebody's building and buying a new one. So they see this great potential. These contractors, like they're making some money. They're having some issues, and they're not meeting production deadlines, which is a challenge to their bottom line. It's a challenge to the profits. But a lot of the banks, a lot of the financiers, they're saying, oh no, we have to go into this industry. We have to get behind the defense sector now more than ever, and it presents a huge challenge to us when we talk to them about, maybe don't invest in companies that build nuclear weapons. But they build so many other weapons. But that's also an opportunity, because we can say, yeah. So you want to invest in weapons production. Isn't there a line? isn't there a place where we can say some weapons are unacceptable? No single bank or any other type of investor I have talked to would consider investing in a company that's connected to the production of landmines. Like, nope, that's a no-go. No one is comfortable with even the suggestion of investing in a company that's connected to cluster munitions. Like, no, 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 no. That kills babies. No, 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 no. School children, bad. Cluster munitions, no, not going there. And yet, nuclear weapons haven't quite got to that level yet. But we have this opportunity to say, hey, you're financing, you're going to give Northrop Grumman a big loan. Make a condition of that loan that they cannot use any of that money for the production of any weapons of mass destruction. Because you talk about bioweapons, they're like, ooh, we won't fund bioweapons. Chemical weapons, like, nope. Let's get them kind of talking about this with nuclear weapons. And when you talk about it and frame it that way, the banks are like, huh, shouldn't I divest from the company? Yes, you should divest from the company. But I can't. Well, do this as a step. Let's get them on board. Let's give them alternatives. And in this last year, a lot of those who have historically been really great and not investing in weapons are changing their tune. They're getting a hard time being called to invest in weapons production, but not weapons of mass destruction. So I just want to really kind of not banned weapons. So I want to, kind of think about that positive side of things, and it's challenging. It's challenging, the work that we do. It's challenging when we see what they're going to pull in on their annual reports, the close of business. Some of these companies did very well last year. Some of them look from the outside like they did very well, but when we see the profit and loss report, we'll see that they actually didn't. It's a great narrative that the arms industry is always profitable. It's not. And we have the opportunity to really expose that. And it's a challenging thing. It's a challenging thing to talk about. All right. With those challenges and different ideas, I wanted to open it up to the room, see if we have any questions or anything people are curious about around this. Yeah, go ahead. There's a microphone? Yeah, just over here, to Mary, I think it is. Thanks. I think so.
Like I want to take, future, investment for the future. So I want to take off the gloves and really go after grandparents, because they say they're making this wealth for their family, for their, their own glory, but their children and their grandchildren. And how can they possibly invest in these corporations who are foreclosing the future?
Oh, so Mary just gave us a really good tagline, foreclosing the future. So I hope somebody uses that in a tweet. Mary Olson said it. That's a good question. I think I saw one other question over here. One, and then two, and then we'll come back. Is that all right?
Yeah, perfect.
Great.
I want to comment on one question, if it's okay. My comment is that this must be very difficult to be precise about. For example, I know that you have Pentagon projects funding basic research within Northern Light physics, for example, which serves a purpose for general basic knowledge of Northern Light, but of course it's important for ballistic missiles, because Northern Light produce noise that can influence on the navigation system for ballistic missiles. So this is it's not easy to limit what is funding for nuclear weapons. But I have a question. And how much money does the Norwegian pension fund use on this issue? Thank you.
Sorry, that was not a sinister laugh, I swear. We've got two over here. Why don't we go? Actually, you know what? If you can give us a chance, why don't we answer this too, and then come back to the other two?
Yeah.
Do you want to start with the? Do you want to start with the grandparents?
The grandparents, yeah. I think. I mean, I'll leave taking the gloves off and going after the grandparents to you. I think. But I think it's also just a part of this picture on the future is that from the investment point of view, these are multi-year, huge industrial projects, which is one of the reasons why it's attractive or can be attractive to invest in. So for many of the current nuclear-armed states, the current modernization plans and maintenance plans go into the next century. The next century. That's quite a long time away. So that's the future horizon they have. Of course, there's a question of can we make it all the way to the next century without something going horribly wrong in the meantime, which is, I think, what you would argue, and I would tend to agree. But I think just from the economic standpoint, that's what some of these investors would think, that these are attractive multi-year, long-term projects.
And the contract with Northrop Grumman for the Sentinel system is, if I recall correctly, it's a 30-year contract. There's a contract with Boeing that's a 70-year contract. Like, to have the arrogance to assume that you're going to be able to pay 70 years of contract fees, and knowing that you adjust those contracts, they make adjustments and increase the payment value and the total value of the contracts every single year. But to go into that and negotiate that is absolutely insane, and I think it is quite arrogant. But it does come back to this. I like this idea of, foreclosing the future. I like this idea of calling out to grandparents, because it is, and a lot of places it's grandparents who are looking at, okay, what are our investments? Can we retire? Can we retire? Are they going to raise the pension age? Can we get there? And to have a real identity and connection and know what's happening within their own pension funds. That's something that, honestly, some younger folks don't necessarily think about, because sometimes we wonder if the future is going to be there. So sometimes it's hard to think about that. On this question of the very specific question about the government pension global and the Norwegian pension fund. The Norwegian pension fund is split into two parts. There's the government pension fund that's specifically in Norway that's invested solely in Norwegian companies. And then there's the government pension fund global. I think she's in the room, Alejandra Munoz from PAX is over there. You probably heard her speak yesterday on nuclear sharing and bringing expertise from the Netherlands. She also has just produced a brilliant report that goes into specifically analyzing who invests what and where. And it's called Don't Bank on the Bomb. And the government pension fund global is connected to $2.5 billion in investments. That said, they have a policy against investing in companies that produce key components for nuclear weapons. They revised and updated that policy 2.5 years ago in order to expand it. So it's also the specifically designed delivery systems. And this is very important. They have not yet applied the new policy to their investment portfolio. And it's something for those Norwegians in the room to ask about. Why did you make a decision and not act on the decision that you made? To the tune of $2.5 billion. And I would encourage you to do that. And when it comes to the question of how do you decide who is involved in the production of nuclear weapons, we take a super conservative look at this. And if I can't make an embarrassing drawing pointing to which part of the nuclear bomb this company makes, I would not encourage, they wouldn't be included in the research, because we need to know and we need to be extremely careful in this, having seen several threats of legal action over the years in producing this kind of research because we've named names. And companies are not happy to be associated with the production of weapons of mass destruction. They do not like it. They do not like it when they get challenged in shareholder meetings. They really don't. And it's kind of fun, in a way, to see some of the communications that come from investors to some of these producers saying, hey, we are concerned about the human rights impact of your products, particularly in light of the future regulatory risk under the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. What are you doing to prepare for the eventual joining of this country to the TPNW, and how are you going to prevent any sort of legal action on the company for doing something illegal, for making nuclear bombs? And they get pissed. Oh my God. No, but like crazy. You know, we all lived through the Donald Trump time, right? And we somehow made it through the other end of that. But this is like a Trumpian temper tantrum. You know, my childs didn't throw temper tantrums this hard. Some of the responses that we've gotten from board members in some of these companies saying there will never be any international agreement that would ever, under any way, shape, or form, control nuclear weapons in any way. And it's like, dude, there's like the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Like, dude, there is a treaty. Dude, there's a UN. Like, dude, chill. But they don't like to chill. They like to yell. But luckily, we're campaigners. We yell back. Anyway, there's 2 more questions over here, if you would, please.
It's a question to Kjølv. You have looked into the 10 top ranks think tanks and total 45 think tanks. I'm a little confused with how you define think tanks, because from the list I've seen in your article, some of them would be what I would call research foundations. But I guess your point is to ask, why is there so little innovation? Follow the money. This is why. And I guess that your conclusion, and that's the question, do you think that your conclusion goes for not only traditional think tanks, but also research foundations and universities and university departments? So it gives the picture that you draw goes for all the research within policy on nuclear weapons.
Good. Yes, please.
My question is actually also for you. You said that at the end that the system can be changed, but do you have some recommendations on how to do that, like some strategy or so? And also on the x-axis, was it measured in %, like the first slide you had? Because I couldn't really read it. Oh, okay.
Okay, this is gone now.
Whatever.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Go ahead.
Well, I just go ahead. Yeah, I'll take the first one first on the definition or operationalization of think tanks. I think our list would include what you would call research foundations. We've simply used the existing ranking of what the University of Pennsylvania's existing index of think tanks calls a think tank. So apparently for them it does include foundations. I think their definition is simply a research institute that is a non-profit but not a university. That is essentially the definition they apply. And then the question, do these conclusions apply to universities as well? I think yes, to a very significant degree, but it's difficult to determine because actually universities are even less transparent about funding than think tanks. Because non-profits generally, this varies a bit from country to country, and we look at think tanks in many different countries. But generally, actually, think tanks are a bit more transparent about their funding than universities. So on the university side, we simply don't know, is the answer. But my gut feeling would be that it's quite similar. Then on the question about the graph, the axis, yes, that was in %. Yeah, correct. So about 90.
Back one.
Okay. There we go. That's in percent. Yeah, the x-axis. So the column I guess you don't have here is the one that says 100% for accepting either one or the other.
If I could add something on the university question.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I come across in looking at contracts a lot of the time are there are universities which are contracted in order to contribute and to contribute to nuclear weapons production and to contribute to the maintenance and development of nuclear arsenals. The University of California system is a very good example because they are responsible for operating the Los Alamos National Laboratory and Sandia National Laboratory and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which are the three major labs in the United States that do nuclear weapons-related research and produce key pieces for nuclear weapons, like Los Alamos is trying to produce 80 new plutonium pits a year, which are the bits of plutonium inside a nuclear weapon that give it their massive, explosive, catastrophic power. And the University of California system is heavily involved in that. The University of Texas A&M is also quite involved in that. And Johns Hopkins University also has a number of contracts. There's also a producer connected to, it's physically located across the street from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology called the Charles Draper Laboratory. It's a not-for-profit. It's not directly under the university board, but it shares a lot of information with the university, and they're involved in Trident and Minutemen production as well, just on the university side of things.
Pentagon on the Charles, I think, was the old nickname for MIT.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. It just occurred to me that another thing that we probably ought to mention that we haven't talked about yet is the role of money in campaign financing and in the revolving door between business, the military, and politics, which is also a hugely important part of this whole conversation about money. And I don't want to single out the United States specifically, because this is this happens in all the nuclear-armed states, but just to take an example of the United States. The current Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, if I remember correctly, he was on the board of Raytheon, nuclear weapons producer. Well, who preceded Lloyd Austin? That was a guy called Esper. He was not on the board of Raytheon, he was the chief lobbyist of Raytheon before he became Secretary of Defense. What about the guy who was Secretary of Defense before him? That was Mad Dog Mattis. He was on the board of General Dynamics, another nuclear weapons producer. So that's a pretty stark picture, I think. And also, if you look at the most recent presidential campaigns for both unsuccessful and successful Democrats and Republicans, all the recent top candidates have accepted campaign financing from a lot of these companies, going back to at least the 80s. This has been the case. So this is another strategy that if you want to ensure that the people in charge of the country have your interests in mind, is the good idea is to fund both sides.
Yeah.
That way you can't really lose.
And it's not just in the US, right? So we see it in the US. The US is a little bit easy because it's very transparent.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's a little bit easier to pick on sometimes. But we also see similar problems, similar challenges when we look at the board of Airbus. And we look, for example, at Airbus. The board of Airbus has deep ties into BNP Paribas, who finance Airbus. Some might call it a good business model. Others might call it corruption. Kind of depends on where you sit and perhaps where you stand on a number of issues. And we see, again, there's differences, but we see a lot of lobbying reports, and some countries are much more transparent. France, there's a great law that requires lobbyists to disclose who they're working for and what they're getting paid. And we put together this information for these companies in a regular report ICAN puts out usually in June that looks at the numbers of nuclear weapons spending, the companies involved, who's on what boards, and why, for example, are board members on Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon also board members of the Ladies Professional Golf Association. I still don't understand this, but I think that they hang out in the clubhouse.
Yeah, and of course they have people on the boards of all of the top-ranked think tanks as well.
Exactly. And they sit on the Atlantic Council, their board members sit, they sit in this, they meet up at the Aspen Institute, and they plot how to keep weapons of mass destruction around. And it's not wrong for us to call this out. It's not wrong for us to question and to demand. When we see in our local papers, why are you quoting this think tank that receives money from the industry? Give me equal space. You say you're fair and balanced. Let's get some space.
I just realized I didn't answer the question about precisely how to make change. I think there are many, many things we could talk about, but I'll just mention one thing, which is education, and specifically education of the media. Because I think one of the big problems that you have is that people who work for these institutions or think tanks that are funded to a large extent by actors who have extremely powerful interests, economic, political interests, in the research that is being done, in the expertise that is being produced. But nonetheless, the people who work for these think tanks are allowed to sign op-eds in the New York Times with only saying analyst at the whatever think tank. So, for example, just one example that I found particularly stark was someone who, just in the period before the INF treaty was cancelled, there was a guy from the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Analysis, which is one of these think tanks, wrote a big op-ed in the New York Times saying that the United States should pull out of the INF treaty and produce intermediate-range missiles. And, well, he works for a think tank that is funded by all of the companies that would be producing these kinds of missiles. And yet the New York Times prints this op-ed without telling its readers anything about any of this, which I think is actually running close to misinformation, if you want to be blunt about it.
And I just want to close on that point, because we're coming to our time. I think one of the things that we do is we make sure that the information is available. We pull it together. But it's up to all of us to take that information and use it, and to be blunt. We can call a liar a liar. We can call people out for producing this misinformation. We can demand better. And being blunt, being direct, takes courage. It takes good information. It takes knowing that you've got wonderful research to back you up. But we can do that, and that's what gives us strength. It's making sure that the conversation is on our terms. What are they going to say? Oh, no, I don't have any connection to these vested interests? Great. Prove it. And it's our job to make sure to call that out constantly and to keep this conversation where we have some control and some influence. And it's always, always, always weapons of mass destruction designed to be indiscriminate, designed to cause unconscionable harm. And we're not going to let anybody get away with it anymore. So on that, I want to say thanks, Kjølv.
Thank you. Cheers.